Hello, everybody, and welcome to Revisioning Sustainability. I'm Anthony Guida, President of Friends of Architecture Santa Fe and Director of Sustainability for AOS Architects. This is the fourth panel discussion in our Revisioning History series, which proposes a critical re-examination of the values and visions that have historically guided planning and development in Santa Fe, in order to better inform solutions for our contemporary challenges and future prosperity. Discussions in this series are dedicated to the key topics that shape our shared built environment, our daily lives, and our communities. In 2020, these included a series introduction and sessions on planning and preservation. Revisioning Housing is coming next in May. Leading voices in architecture, planning, and community development are our panelists. Their analysis and the participatory discussions that follow are intended to challenge us to think differently, to animate informed discourse, and to inspire new collective visions for a more livable, equitable, and sustainable Santa Fe. We're so happy to have you all be a part of tonight's event. Just a few housekeeping items and kind of ground rules. In the first hour, I will provide a brief introduction to Revisioning Sustainability, which will be followed by a series of 10-minute presentations by each of our panelists. And there are four panelists tonight. The second hour is dedicated to audience Q&A and discussion with the panel, which will be moderated by Carlos Gamora, City of Santa Fe Senior Land Use Planner and Friends of Architecture Board Member. When you have questions, please submit them using Zoom's Q&A feature. You're encouraged to do this as questions come to mind, and especially during the panelist presentations. If your question is being posed to a particular panelist, please note that in your Q&A. Behind the scenes, we'll be ordering these questions in order to facilitate the discussion, and we'll try our best to get to everyone. I think that's all the kind of upfront items I have, so I'm going to dive into the introduction. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, this is Revisioning Sustainability. There's no way to sugarcoat this, so I won't. We know we're dealing with a climate emergency. We know that the clock is ticking and that we have only about 10 years to set ourselves on the right path. Rather than discuss a grab bag of sustainability ideas, we wanted to focus on the big picture tonight. The very urgent emissions reduction targets at the global scale, and their intersection with meaningful actions for achieved and sustained climate impact, resilience, and leadership on the community scale. The question is, what is impactful? When it comes to sustainability, we often think about individual consumer choices, reducing our carbon footprint by flying less, buying an electric car, installing rooftop PV, eating less meat. Without question, these are all good things to do. And while we can understand the relative impact of these choices, it's often difficult to understand where they fit into the big picture. For much of my 6 years in Santa Fe, I was fortunate to be the Education Program Director for Architecture 2030, a nonprofit committed to solving climate change through the building sector. Architecture 2030 was started by Santa Fe architect Edward Masria, who is responsible for reframing that big picture. In 2003, he redrew this pie chart to position building energy demand, not energy production overall, as the major contributor of the global greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. Today, building operations account for roughly 28% of global greenhouse gas emissions annually. And that's through the fossil fuels burned on site or at utilities to heat, cool, ventilate, power, and light buildings. An additional 11% stem from embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is the CO2 associated with the extraction, manufacture, and transport of core building materials and products. and the construction of buildings themselves. The powerful idea here is that if buildings are the primary contributor to global climate change at some 40%, they're also perhaps our most powerful lever for solving it by quickly reducing carbon emissions in the building sector to zero. Thanks to Ed Masria and Architecture 2030's work in this this is increasingly being understood by the profession, as well as state and municipal governments. More is needed, but better energy codes, policies, and design practices have shown demonstrable progress in dramatically reducing operational emissions. US building sector energy use is better than flat, and CO2 emissions are down some 20% despite adding more than 30 billion square feet to our building stock since 2005. The tougher nut to crack is embodied carbon. It's much harder to quantify, and only a few are addressing it in policy or in practice. But we know that reusing buildings, choosing carbon sequestering materials like mass timber, and emerging low carbon concretes and steel are the way forward. Shown here is roughly a quarter of current building sector emissions annually. We know this percentage of embodied carbon emissions will only increase as operational emissions improve. This is still a misleading picture, though. Problem is that unlike a building's operational emissions, embodied emissions are all upfront. They occur when a building is built, not over time. This means that for projected new construction over the next 3 decades, and building the way we currently do, that the emissions for embodied and operational carbon are actually shown to be nearly equivalent, not 1/4 and 3/4, but nearly equivalent over the course of 30 years. And the amount of new construction is staggering. Currently, half of the world's population lives in cities. By 2060, 2/3 of the projected 10 billion people on the planet will be urban dwellers. Global building stock is forecasted to increase by 2.5 trillion square feet, doubling the building area that currently exists. Another way of putting this is that this is the equivalent of adding another New York City, all 5 boroughs, to the planet every month for the next 40 years. And this graphic from the UN depicts a truly terrifying outcome of that scenario. As the population grows and as developing nations increasingly build to Western standards between now and 2050, the embodied carbon emissions of just 3 materials used for the construction of new buildings and urban infrastructure, concrete, steel, and aluminum, could be as high as 350 gigatons. That total for embodied emissions alone represents the lion's share of the world's remaining carbon budget to stay under 1.5 degrees centigrade. This is widely recognized and codified in the Paris Climate Accord as being the threshold for averting the worst impacts of climate change. We understand that all emissions, building sector emissions and all others, need to get to zero. This is often expressed as the global goal of net zero emissions by the year 2050. But that's not quite right. A steady drop from now to 2050 would leave us emitting 600 gigatons when 500 gigatons is the actual estimate of a reasonable carbon budget for staying under 1.5 degrees centigrade. We need to move much, much faster. This chart shows how we might get to 500 gigatons, which was really only a 50% chance, a 50-50 chance of staying under that 1.5 degrees. A much more aggressive but far less risky strategy would reduce emissions faster, targeting a 340 gigaton budget, reducing all emissions by 65% in the next 10 years, and reaching zero by 2040. This seems really hard. It's not impossible, but we need to get to work. Architecture 2030 has laid out this path and the magnitude of its impacts. It's shockingly reasonable. Right now, we stop building new fossil fuel power plants and focus only on renewable energy production. We stop building new buildings that burn fossil fuels on site. This is called electrification, and cities like San Francisco and Berkeley have done this. 50 more municipalities in California are currently considering banning so-called natural gas. This is not an out there idea. Heat pump mechanical systems and induction stoves are demonstrably more versatile and efficient, with none of the related health impacts and enormous fugitive emissions or dangers of using what's called fracked gas. By 2030, half of all existing buildings are retrofitted to be all electric. We decommission all coal plants and move to carbon neutral steel and concrete in new construction. By 2040, we electrify all buildings old and new. We offline all remaining gas power plants and go to carbon neutral in all building materials. Beyond 2040, beyond that 0 point, the built environment goes to zero, goes beyond zero. It produces more clean renewable energy than it consumes, and it is designed to be a carbon sink, providing a net benefit to the planet. So briefly back to this graphic. It's important to recognize that the impact of the entire built environment is far more than the 40% that's attributed to just buildings. How we plan cities and where we build housing is a big part of the transportation piece. There are enormous embodied carbon impacts to the infrastructure that services sprawl, which claims much more of the industrial piece of the pie here. Potable water has embodied energy and carbon in it. And the source of the energy that powers water treatment, electricity to buildings, industry, and the vehicles that we drive unites it all. All of these are interconnected. Tonight, our brilliant panelists will dive into why transportation planning, water use, renewable energy, and building reuse are major drivers for necessary climate action in Santa Fe. More importantly, we'll talk about how rethinking our approaches to density, growth, equity, preservation, and preservation are the keys to having impact locally. I'd like to start with our panelist presentations, and first I'm going to introduce Erick Aune. Erick is a transportation and urban planner, and is currently the Santa Fe Metropolitan Planning Organization officer. Inspired by the impacts of roadway design on all elements of community, he is dedicated to supporting innovative design that improves safety and livability for all of our users on our roadways. He has practiced land use and transportation planning in the Southwest since 1996. Erick also serves as the immediate past president of the American Planning Association New Mexico chapter and president of the New Mexico Resilience Alliance, dedicated to bringing needed resources to underserved communities throughout New Mexico. Welcome, Erick.
Welcome, everybody. This is the story of Cerrillos Road through the lens of sustainability. This is not so much a critique of Cerrillos, but an unveiling of its birth and key plans and policies that contributed to its rise and dominance as the commercial corridor in Santa Fe. It is also a story about choices and the challenge to balance convenience with community. In 2016, transportation emissions surpassed the energy sector in greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Like Cerrillos, roadways and their design contribute significantly to the end result of tailpipe emissions. On average, Cerrillos moves over 40,000 vehicle trips per day. Santa Fe Transit was moving 2 million people trips per year by 2015. The number of businesses along its watershed, both local and global, provide millions of dollars into the city's coffers via gross receipts tax. Hold on just a second. Sorry, we're starting with HGL's time machine. I borrowed his time machine, so together we can travel back in the past. In chapter 1 of The Time Machine, Wells writes, "You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert 1 or 2 ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, that you were taught in school is founded on misconception," unquote. So we start here in 1930, where Santa Fe enjoyed a population of just over 11,000 people. Cerrillos by then, Route 66, is serene and carving its path towards downtown. My favorite author, Wendell Berry, an agro-community philosopher of sorts, once stated during a presentation, a community in context creates its own self-limitations. Cerrillos through times reveals decision points where community context is celebrated, and others where it becomes more of a victim of its own doing. So the railroad comes to Santa Fe, bringing tourists, business, growth. Cerrillos may be an infant here, but the confluence of travel access and the desire to lure tourists would be its parental force for years to come. This is an extraordinary capture of a community in context. The architecture, the streets, the open space, the agriculture all speak to a quality of life, a sense of harmony, and our first glimpse at Cerrillos right here in the right-hand corner, not far from the new railroad depot. And here, the new state capitol in Cerrillos, growing up. The 1912 city plan was and still is a compelling story of a community with a vision and a willingness to implement it. Santa Fe, New Mexican editorial quote, as New Mexico streets and parks are laid out, as old streets are widened, straightened, and extended, the work might as well be done in accordance with a scientific plan. Harmony and beauty, as in the old way that meant crooked streets, unsanitary slums, discomfort, and ugliness. Statehood in 1912 led to the creation of the State Highway Commission, which provided broader powers and duties to plan and advise on road construction and a state system of roads. Cerrillos Road's DNA and destiny was becoming well established as exemplified by these fellows driving down the Capitol steps in 1912. This stark and powerful image, south of Santa Fe now, reflects the transition from the power of the railroad industry, shifting to that of the automobile industry. By 1928, Cerrillos was growing up, as seen here by next to a vintage auto service station, and the precursor to the motel, the Fort Marcy Camp Cabins, for tourists, of course. Interestingly, the State Tourist Bureau was created in 1935 as a division of the Highway Department. Roads meant jobs and wealth for New Mexico. By 1939, Cerrillos lost its distinction as Route 66, but gains international stardom as a leg of the now Pan-American Central Highway stretching from Argentina to Alaska. The 1939 World's Fair is deeply embedded in Cerrillos' DNA as designers and the automobile industry teamed up to establish the vision for roadways and cities of the future, wider, faster, and more freedom and independence than ever imagined. It cannot be understated that the 1947 Bartholomew City Plan, Harlan Bartholomew City Plan, a plan with sort of a brute force tenor, compelled the community to begin what is a prescriptive and measured design of the city of Santa Fe. Bartholomew, born in 1889, by 1947, had his fingerprints in city plans across the nation. Page 51, quote from the plan. From the viewpoint of a man in an automobile, many improvements are needed in Santa Fe's present street system. Here's their idea of the improvements. Though this highway plan cutting through downtown did not get built, it did pave the way for expansion of existing streets and ultimately the state's 1970 St. Francis roadway with similar design elements. Quote from the plan, local traffic moving to the business district from the south and north in an efficient yet inconspicuous manner. The street plan proposes a new state highway. Inconspicuous. You keep using that word. The plan recommended zoning combined with more prescriptive design standards and a thirst for auto access and mobility. Santa Fe, like most US cities, were beginning to crack open, and Cerrillos became its chisel. With a quick stop in 1955, we can see that old Cerrillos Road still enjoys today a level of scale and walkability and context that embraces community. With Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis cruising through downtown, please note the ubiquitous traffic light at the center, presumably established here in the 30s or 40s, the plaza is still governed by this traffic signal here today, where a simple four-way stop would suffice. We often retrain street design elements without reflection for decades and decades. Cerrillos may teach us something about this. By 1964, Cerrillos is becoming one of the visions of 1939. They called it, look, you can phone from your car here. Who would have thought? How cool is that? Congestion. Congestion in traffic and how we continue to try to design our way out of it are somewhat of a paradox. Congestion by all measures is not the cultural boogie monster we might have been taught, like H.G. Wells's comment about misconception. The design deficiency of St. Mike's you see here comes with it a great sacrifice. The congestion seen on a typical downtown street in this other photo may appear menacing. Is actually a safer and slower street, as demonstrated by the casual engagement of the driver and pedestrians here. This cultural convenience of larger roadways are baked into our unconscious expectations, and harmful externalities, even when rationally explained, lose impact when we consider alternatives. Cerrillos and St. Mike's tells us that affluence breeds traffic. Perhaps a more appropriate way to define congestion and our efforts to build out of it is people with the economic means to act on their social and economic interests, getting in the way of other people with the means to act on theirs. Cerrillos reveals our community's accepted lines of desire versus what current plans reveal over and over again, that the vast majority of the public desires a more walkable, equitable, and livable community. Traffic can be considered an expression of human purpose. Once we get in a car, we remove ourselves from community and act in our individual best interest. If we can collectively and consciously get out of the cars, and perhaps maybe we can see congestion as a net positive. Slower, more sustainable roads work well in Santa Fe. And again, striving to reduce congestion comes at a human sacrifice too. The year is 2014. No need for detailing the stats on how many parking spaces you're looking at or the square footage of pavement. Parking for everyone, free parking for everyone, harms everyone and requires roadways to be designed like highways. It is important to note that today that more people take more driving trips on any given Saturday at 1 p.m. than any other time of the week. Free parking is most likely the #1 contributing factor for the size of Cerrillos we see today. But there is hope. As we jump into the future, the year is 2024, and our friends in Paris have transformed one of the most famous roadways in the world from this to this. Though Cerrillos may not enjoy such prestige, there are hundreds of ways to modify policies, design standards, zoning codes, transit lines that may tame Cerrillos and bring community back into context. I argue it starts with a vision just like this. Today, Santa Fe is strongly considered pursuing a road diet or lane reduction for St. Mike's, which will soon be under city jurisdiction again. The NMDOT currently is redesigning Cerrillos from St. Francis to St. Mike's and will be seeking public input this spring. And Cerrillos, after its 100-year journey with the state facility, will be returning back to its roots to the city of Santa Fe jurisdiction this spring, allowing the city more control in what Cerrillos will become for the next 100 years. So I return you safely on this journey back from 1930 to present day dynamic transformation of 2021. I hope you enjoyed the trip. Thank you.
Eric, thank you for that trip. I'm left thinking that that Cerrillos Road is from a time that's even more different than the times that created the east side of Santa Fe. So I'm sure we're going to have a good discussion about this later. So next, I'd like to introduce Jesse Roach. Jesse is the director of the City of Santa Fe's Water Division, where he has led a strategic effort and development, where he's led a strategic planning effort and development of long-range water resource planning processes and provided leadership in support of new water resources and development. His technical areas of expertise include municipal operations and demand, potential climate change impacts on water resources, surface water to groundwater dynamics, and agricultural operations and demand. He was the technical lead on an assessment of potential climate change impacts to water resources and possible resulting changes to water operations in the Upper Rio Grande Basin, and a contributor to the technical evaluation of water utility scale adaptation to potential hydrologic impacts of climate change in Santa Fe. Welcome, Jesse.
Thank you, Anthony. It's my honor to be here. I would like to continue the time travel, and I'm going to, excuse me, tell a story of sustainability with respect to water in 4 acts. Starting out with a quick map overview, just to take away that the city of Santa Fe has 4 different water sources. There are 2 surface water sources, the Santa Fe River shown in blue here, and water diverted from the Rio Grande shown in green. And there are also 2 groundwater sources where water is pumped from wells out of the city well field, which is within the Santa Fe River watershed, and from the Buckman well field outside of the city watershed. From a sustainability perspective, we think of surface water as our checking account, and we think of groundwater as our savings account, something that we would like to save for a dry year. So the first act of our time travel is from 1880 through 1995, and I'm calling it Sustainability Lost. This chart shows the production of water by the city of Santa Fe for that period of time. And one of the first things that will probably immediately jump out is that we were looking at exponential growth of demand through that period. There are 3 different colors shown on the graph, and those represent different sources of water. And so we were starting with just the Santa Fe River source. And by the 1950s, when we hit a historic drought, that wasn't enough. And we added wells within the city in our city well field, but demand continued to grow. And by the 70s, we had to add another groundwater source, in this case, the Buckman well field. That took us to 1995. By 1995, we were in an unsustainable position from a water resources perspective. We were using too much groundwater. We were using our savings account, and we were out of balance. In 1995, what was previously a private water company owned by P&M was purchased by the city, and immediately an aggressive conservation program was implemented. And since that time, for the last 25 years, we have driven our total demand down from over 13,000 acre feet per year in 1995 to around 8,500 acre feet in the last couple of years, adding customers that whole time. The other important thing that happened in the last 25 years was that in 2011, we brought the Buckman direct diversion online, which gave us direct access to San Juan Chama surface water. As a result, in the last decade, and especially the last 5 years, our production has been dominated by surface water production. And so we have reached sustainability from the perspective of water resources. We're relying on our surface water, we're resting our groundwater and saving it for those dry years. But that sustainability is threatened. And so now we're moving into the future. And the 2 main drivers that threaten the current sustainability that we've landed on are growth in demand and climate change. This graph goes from 2020 forward to 2070, so for the next 50 years, and it looks at what shortages might look like. And so this would be how much demand exceeds supply if we don't do anything, if we don't change anything about the system. And we're looking at 2 different demand scenarios, a low growth scenario in blue and a high growth scenario in red. And the shading around each of these, the blue shading represents the supply uncertainty. What different climate change models think will occur to the water resources as we move forward. And so there's a lot of uncertainty moving forward, but it's clear that we need to do something. And so what is it that we're going to do? So we took a quick look previously at this wheel of production, let's call it. And what I want to point out now is that of the total water that we produce from these 4 sources, about a third of it is lost to our system. And that is because it is used outdoors or it leaks from the system. But fully 2/3 almost of the water goes down the drain, goes down the sink, goes down the shower, is flushed down the toilet, and flows through the sewer system and arrives at our water reclamation facility. And so fully 2/3 of what we're producing is available at the water reclamation facility. This is the key to the next phase of sustainability for the city. And the way that we're proposing to essentially turn some of that water back into potable water is, in the near term, is through an exchange. And so currently, the water that we divert at the Buckman Direct Diversion is all released from upstream, from water that we have in storage upstream on the Chama system. The idea of this return flow pipeline is to use effluent for return flow credits. And so we are working on this now and hope that within this decade, we will have a return flow pipeline to take the San Juan Chama portion of our unconsumed water back to the Rio Grande, put it into the Rio Grande at a point just below the diversion location, so that the same diversion now is made up of water in the river from upstream and water, an equal amount of water that we put back in the river from our return flow pipeline, such that we can have the same diversions we have now with the much smaller release of water from upstream reservoirs. So with this pipeline, we would be making the river whole with the effluent return, and there would be no change to the Rio Grande flows below this point in either of these two scenarios, just a much smaller release of water from upstream reservoirs. Which brings me to our current growth paradigm. Right now, development in Santa Fe and the increased water demand that comes with it is supported from a water resources perspective by conservation, and we continue to work hard on conservation, but we have grabbed the lowest hanging fruits there, and so the returns are diminishing to some degree, and largely from purchase of water rights on the Rio Grande. The way that that works is that when we pump our Buckman well field, it has impacts on the Rio Grande. It induces seepage on the Rio Grande. Those impacts must be offset by water rights on the Rio Grande. This is a permanent transfer of water from agricultural use to municipal use. The conserved and purchased water is tracked in something we call the water bank, if you've heard of that. The reason that this works is that essentially this table on the right shows that we have water rights essentially equal to the sort of what we estimate as our renewable supply in 3 of our 4 sources. But in the Buckman well field, we don't have as many water rights as there is available renewable water there. And so essentially we're drying up agriculture in downstream of Cochiti and transferring it to our well field. The thing we don't like as much about that is, as I said, we would like to rely on our surface water and save our groundwater for times of need. And so building with groundwater resources is not quite where we want to be. And so I want to suggest the possibility of a new paradigm. And to do that, tell a story of Albuquerque ahead of us, who from 1982 on was buying Middle Rio Grande water rights to support their growth. In 2008, they began to fully consume their San Juan Chama water through surface water diversions and downstream return flows. And in 2016, at the end of a long-range planning process that looked out 100 years, they just realized they didn't need to continue to buy those rights, and they formally exited the water rights market. Our hope is that sometime this decade, we'll begin to fully consume our San Juan Chama water via this return flow pipeline, and that following that, we will be able to also exit the market for agricultural rights. And finally, the fourth act in our water sustainability story is even further out, imagining from 2070 forward. And now I want you to imagine a future where climate change has drastically reduced our sustainable surface water resources. So I'm going to throw out the number 4,000 acre-feet per year. That's about half of what we have now. But let's also imagine a future where all effluent can be turned into potable water. Now we're proposing in the near term to turn a portion of that into potable water sort of indirectly by exchange. In the longer term, if hydrology or water quality constraints force it, this may be direct potable reuse, which is treating water to drinking water standards and returning it directly into the system. This is very energy intensive, so that ties us back to where we started with carbon and energy. But let's imagine this, there's nothing technically that would prevent us from being able to do this. And with our current loss rate, so we currently lose about 33% of the water, we would have available 12,000 acre feet each year, which is 1.5 times what we use now, of which 8,000 would be returned and in this sort of circle, this closed loop. But imagine if we could drive those losses down to 20%, then we'd have 20,000 acre feet a year available, 2.5 times what we're using now. And if we drove it down to 10%, we'd have 5 times what we're using now. We'd be adding 4,000 acre feet per year of renewable surface water each year and recycling 36,000 acre feet a year. So I'll leave you with this thought. The growth of our sustainable, the growth in Santa Fe that our sustainable water resources can support depends on our willingness and ability to reuse our effluent and how much potentially potable water we use outside.
Eric, thank you for debunking another myth of Santa Fe about there not being enough water for us, for everybody to live here and for the city to grow. It's something I'm sure we'll talk about more in the discussion. And already I see the Q&A lighting up after your presentation, so looking forward to that. Next, I would very much like to introduce Mariel Nanasi. Mariel is the Executive Director and President of New Energy Economy. She is a civil rights and criminal defense attorney by trade. And since 2008, she has used her legal expertise in organizing skills to address climate change and promote clean energy alternatives in New Mexico as a model for the rest of the country. How are you, Mariel?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for this wonderful presentation, provocative presentation. And it's perfect that I followed Jesse Roach because Jesse's presentation focused on resiliency from dependency on a private company to essentially public empowerment. And that's where my conversation with you tonight begins. So I'm going to share my screen. And do you see that all, everybody? Is it working? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So for the last 100 years, we have relied on centralized generation. What's that? It means that electric companies have built large coal, gas, and nuclear facilities in places where people of color and poor people live. Those people have had little political power. The toxic fumes or ash raining down from the stacks, the poisons that leached into the waterways, or the radiation spewed onto the land has had a deleterious impact on the health and welfare of hundreds of thousands of people. It has also meant that the power generated from these large power plants were transmitted through big transmission lines hundreds of miles away to load centers like in Santa Fe or Albuquerque. Power generated on Navajo Nation, transmitted 300 miles from here, was called by the Nixon administration an energy sacrifice zone. I literally took this picture of Kamium Woody, a 5-year-old who lives under the toxic shadow of the San Juan generating station. And we have worked at New Energy Economy to close that San Juan generating station. And we in 2017, we were successful in having PNM close half of that plant. And in 2022, the other half will be closed. %86% of P&M's energy portfolio comes from fossil fuels and nuclear. 30% of our, when we flip the switch or boot up our computer, 30% comes from nuclear in Arizona at the Palo Verde nuclear generating station. 39% still comes from the San Juan generating station and Four Corners power plant. And 17% comes from fracked gas. Only 4% comes from solar, 9% comes from wind, and 1% comes from geothermal. This has led to a combination of intersecting crises: environmental and climate crisis, as Anthony spoke about, income inequality, which I'll get to in a minute, and the outsized growth of energy companies, literally having more money. These energy companies have more money than in the history of money, and corresponding political influence, ultimately leading to the fundamental undermining of our democracy. Corporate power has grown so large that public health and safety are at risk. Let me show you this slide. This was literally just filed by P&M in the Public Regulation Commission. And this is where we are right now in 2020. And this is where we started, right? So we had all these carbon emissions. And one of the things that Anthony says at the very beginning of this whole presentation, we must stop the burning of coal. But the trajectory for all of that, so we as I spoke to you before, in 2017, 2 of the units were retired. And now in 2022, coming up, we'll be closing the rest of San Juan generating station. But currently, P&M wants to keep this Four Corners burning till 2031, though this is their current plan, is to sell it to another entity. We are trying to get them to close that, not sell it, and close it before 2025. But the rest of their trajectory has us going carbon free, which means nuclear, till 2040. And here's the economic situation. Since 2008, New Mexico real median income has gone down by 3.6%. In that same period of time, rates have gone up 63%. CEO pay is up 122%. P&M stock has risen over 301%, and their profits 654%. And what I like to say is that we're not only digging up the earth, raping the earth of coal, uranium, and gas and oil, but we are literally extracting the wealth of our communities and exporting it to Wall Street. So here's another idea, another way of thinking of what's possible. Picary's Pueblo, and this picture, you can see me there right here, was taken in 2018, and they were allowed to, the first Pueblo in New Mexico, it's also the smallest Pueblo in New Mexico, about 85 families, about 300 community members, is allowed to basically go solar, 100% solar during the day. And they bought 1 megawatt. And 1 megawatt is approximately the equivalent of serving the electric needs of 200 families, 200 households. They not only immediately reduced the electricity bills for every single family member, they reinvested the money from the surplus of the sales, because as I told you, 1 megawatt serves about 200 homes, and there are only 85 homes. So they got to resell it to the other community members. And with that extra surplus, we'll call it, they've done a number of things. One is they invested in a language program. 2 is they built a new baseball field. 3 is they have a hiking and biking trail. And they just broke ground on a welcome center. And I was there at this time with a number of, well, we had a field trip with the other pueblos. Then we invited them to come so that they could essentially get jealous and want to what we wanted to do is with this field trip is expose the vision of what's possible so that other pueblos might do this. But the only reason this was allowed is because Kit Carson bought its freedom from, that's a terrible name for the electric co-op, but I didn't make that up. That's in Taos. They bought their freedom from Tri-State. And then when Picaris decided to do this 1 megawatt solar project, they made a deal with Kit Carson, and Kit Carson said, we will buy your excess power and deliver it on our system. And that's how they were able to do it, because of this unique situation. But for all of us, we're prevented. We can have rooftop solar, which, like Anthony said before, it's important to make individual choices. But if we're going to address systematic challenges, we have to consider 2 important bills. One is community solar. PNM and the other utilities fought rooftop solar for 3 years. PNM and the other utilities have fought community solar for about 10 or a dozen years. Community solar is exactly like rooftop solar. It's just on a bigger scale. And basically, subscribers buy a certain percentage of that solar garden, let's call it. And then that energy that's produced is credited onto their bill. That would be important. And it's an important step because it would create up to 100 megawatts per year. And in New Mexico, we could have 100 megawatts of community solar projects per year. And that would be a start. It's a start. 19 states and the District of Columbia have community solar. Unfortunately, we in New Mexico didn't learn from best practices and create the greatest access for community solar in our community solar bill because of the intense lobbying of the utility industry in our legislature. They put on a lot of roadblocks, regulatory roadblocks to this. It is now pending. It's going to House Government Committee tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So should you be interested, please write those committee members. You just go on nmlegis.gov and write to those committee members and ask them to pass the community solar bill. Not perfect, but we could work with it. And then we can change it as we start developing it. But then there's something bigger, and that's what I want to leave you with. Imagine if, just like Jesse spoke about the city of Santa Fe buying the utility, the water utility back and taking it away from private hands and putting it back in the public hands, and look at the success it has already had in just a few years. What if we did that with energy? I believe that we could have what we are calling local choice energy, which has been adopted in 9 states so far. And we could be 100% renewable plus battery storage in 5 years. In 5 years. That is aligned with the IPCC goals and the climate emergency that we are currently in. The Energy Transition Act and PNM's basically stalling till 2045 is not going to get us there. And we're not going to get there because we're going to lose out on money. We're going to lose out on this essentially snail's pace path to renewables. With local choice energy across the nation, what we have seen is somewhere, depends on where it is, 2 to 20% lower rates, 100% renewable energy plus storage. Because it's not for profit, we have other priorities. We are allowed to focus on reliability, on safety, on security, on stability, on local job creation. And with those funds, just like Picaris, we could reinvest the money that we save back into other community needs instead of exporting that to Wall Street. The bill, the local choice energy bill, is literally pending right now at this very moment in the Tax, Revenue, and Transportation Committee. And as soon as I'm done with this presentation, I'll be going there to listen to that. So you can go to nmlegis.gov and go to the Senate committee hearing to hear the debate on that if it gets called tonight. So thank you so very much for listening. And there are policy opportunities. We just need the political will to implement them. Thank you very much.
Mariel, thank you. And thank you for taking time away at a very important time to be with us tonight. This is really terrific. It occurs to me that, these are very reasonable ideas, and that the unreasonable idea is that in 2021, we're still burning coal in the United States. Let's talk about that in the discussion. Next, I would very much like to introduce Jean Carroon for our final presentation from our panelists tonight. Jean is an architect and principal of Goody Clancy in Boston, where she leads the firm's preservation practice, focusing on the opportunities inherent in the stewardship and creative reuse of existing buildings to create a healthy, resilient world. She leads a team dedicated to helping clients and the public connect historic legacies to current realities and future possibilities. Her approach combines a mastery of history and building technology with a commitment to transforming places, redefining their relevance, utility, and flexibility, while sustaining and enhancing essential beauty and value. Jean joins us tonight and from Boston. We're really glad that you've come all this way to join us, but it's more than just a kind of similarity of practice from East Coast to Santa Fe. Jean has deep connections in Santa Fe, and we're so excited that she's a part of this panel. Take it away, Jean.
Thank you, Anthony. Well, it's fun to be in Santa Fe, even virtually, but I appreciate being part of this. So what I wanted to start with, let's see, my mouse seems to be a little frozen. Let's see what happens. Oh, nope, I'm still froze. Oh, there, we'll back up. So I wanted to reiterate what Anthony said, and actually what this panel is demonstrating, and what I think is actually so exciting about the rising conversation about climate action. Everything is connected to everything else. And too often when we're talking about buildings, we're really focusing on single issues about policies or codes that reduce the operational energy use or potentially reduce the water use. We recognize that we need to build in a way that reduces transportation. But what Anthony was pointing out is it isn't just about the buildings, the way they operate. It is really about everything that goes into buildings, and it's what buildings do for us. So it's been an exciting time in the last almost a decade now, especially for the heritage community, because in 2015, when the United Nations created global goals that looked at sustainable development, they called out heritage. And this was actually the first time that the United Nations had linked heritage to sustainability, to a healthy, sustainable world. So for the heritage community, it was a time of celebration. It has increased the conversations that are happening. It has given real visibility to what heritage is about. We continue to see publications. This was presented in 2016 at Habitat 3 about how essential heritage is for a healthy world, both environmentally, emotionally, and socially. All of those things are important. And for those of us who work in heritage, sometimes these things are sort of a well duh. Like, of course we know. Why would Santa Fe be so popular if it weren't about heritage, if it weren't about the spiritual lift that we get from seeing places with history, with culture that we can connect to? So the statement that sustainable cities are important and that we need integrated policy making that builds on culture is absolutely critical. But this is not a call to freeze places in time. Indeed, this is actually a clarion call for those of us within the heritage community to really reconsider what stewardship means and what our place in climate action is, for us to be more proactive, to be involved, engaged, to help save the planet, basically, not just to freeze the places that we love. So what we see is a rising conversation across the world, actually, with more and more direction, more and more guidance, more and more exciting policies happening that are sometimes initiated by NGOs or by whole city government or by agencies like Historic England that are asking us to reconsider what stewardship means, how we can use the old technologies that we understand, the old ways of doing things, and the new ways of doing things in more positive, proactive ways that really help us address the most critical issue of our time, which is the climate crisis that we're in. And one of the things that my office and others are involved in is something called the Climate Heritage Network. This was actually one of the founding members of this is Julie Polanco, who is the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Officer in California. And what it is a continued call to action of asking organizations, states, governments, people, the Smithsonian is a member of this, my company is a member of this, to really become a force within climate action, to use cultural heritage and our knowledge of cultural heritage and proactively move to try to change the direction that our world's been going in. Some wonderful resources are coming out. This was a publication from the International Council on Monuments and Sites, The Future of Our Past. It's listed on the website that Anthony posted. It is one of the resources under my name. And I highly recommend it if you are involved in the heritage community. It ties what's going on in climate change to the impact that it's having on communities, on buildings, but it also then connects to what are the proactive things we can do to decrease climate change, to be more positive in protecting our resources and to rethink what stewardship is all about. And who better to do this than those of us who work within the heritage sector, within existing buildings, because we've known all along that it isn't just about recycling. It's about reducing our material use. It's about reusing our biggest objects, which are buildings. I'm always excited to see people reusing grocery bags or reusing water bottles or reusing mugs. But for heaven's sakes, think about how many mugs are in a building. Let's reuse our very largest objects. We have known for almost a decade ago, the National Trust, the Preservation Green Lab, did what's called a life cycle assessment on buildings across the country. And life cycle assessment is not new. It is an assessment of the environmental impacts in any product. It's been used within the manufacturing industries for many years and is now becoming a much more easily used tool for assessing our choices in building materials and evaluating what it means to replace our buildings. So our office looks at every single project that we do and analyzes the environmental impact of every material that goes into a building, whether it's a new building or a renovation. And then we track that and we can compare it. For the architects in the room, we use the tool called Tally, which is a software tool. We work completely in Revit, a three-dimensional program that quantifies all the materials that are going into a building. And then the additional software program takes those quantities, looks at the materials, and assesses the environmental impact, which is translated into something called an embodied carbon or a greenhouse gas potential. The language is not perfect. You know, this is really, when people talk about carbon, they're really using a shorthand to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, which are not just about CO2, it's about all of the gases. And we are not yet sophisticated enough to really be addressing some of the other environmental impacts, which are about the amount of water that is used to make materials, the other environmental impacts, and the social equity that often comes, or inequity that often comes from our choices in materials. But we're at least talking about it, and we're moving on, and we're being able to do some real analysis and comparison. So I'm going to show you one case study, which is just one of many that we feel really underlines the fact that building reuse is absolutely essential to changing the carbon line that Anthony showed us in order to get the biggest bang for the buck. What we're always looking for is we want to know how much harm we have done to the environment with the materials that we're using, and balance that harm against the operational energy that we are reducing. I'll bet I get some questions about this, but basically, you have to spend greenhouse gas carbon in order to reduce your operational energy by doing things like putting new systems in, putting new windows in. All of that has environmental impacts. We want to know when the environmental impacts that we have spent actually end up being a positive thing for the environment as a whole. And we really, really want to see that positive payback happen as quickly as possible in order to drive the curve down and get us closer to meeting the Paris Agreement goals. So charts are not always quickly understood, but this is looking at the carbon that comes from renovating a building. The dotted line is the amount of operational carbon that would continue to go into the atmosphere if nothing were done, if it were an unrenovated building. The lower line is the renovated building, and you can see, I hope, on the end of the slide that the renovated building has a little higher piece because of the carbon we spent to get the renovated building. But it crosses the line of the unrenovated within 2 years. That means that we have significantly started saving carbon emissions into the environment 2 years after we renovated this building. So that's very good. We're very excited by that. The line is also lower because in renovating, we clearly have reduced our operational energy, and that's always the goal. And every time you renovate, you reduce more operational energy. And so the line for operation is always going down. The question is, what is the investment to get there? So then we look at, okay, what if our client didn't save this building? What if we tore that building down and we rebuilt in exact replica with modern materials. I mean, you know, we're trying to do apples to apples here. And I know for people that are developers, they'll say, oh, you could have built a bigger building, but we really want to know what a new building of the exact same size and configuration and materials, how much that carbon would cost. And so you can see the replacement building, the embodied carbon on the left is much higher than the renovated building because it has a lot more materials in it. And it's still, but it has a better energy. We've given it a little bonus in its operational energy by saying that in a new building, we could actually drive our energy use even lower. But then this has a pretty good payback. We could tear down that building. We could put a replacement building in, and it would pay back that investment in 11 years. Still not as good as 2 years though, and still a long way from crossing the line of the replacement building and the renovated building, which is way out there. So then we say, okay, we know the great news is, thanks to all the work that good people are doing, that the grid is greening. Our sources of energy are going to get better. We are going to cause less pollution from the energy that we're using in our buildings. And so that's going to flatten the operational energy curve for every building, both the unrenovated, the replacement, and the renovated. But you can see that the lines still don't ever cross because the embodied carbon actually becomes more impactful as the operational carbon goes down. It actually starts to put more burden on the greenhouse gas that's being caused by materials because that's where the impact of the buildings are. And Anthony alluded to that, and it's a little hard for people to grasp right away, but the point is, as we drive down our operational energy, the carbon from material selection is becoming ever more important. And I also like to point out that as it's not just about greenhouse gas, it's really about equity. And so much of what we put into our buildings and our materials is creating inequity on other parts of the planet. Not necessarily in our backyards, but where the energy is happening, it's definitely creating inequities. Where the silica is coming from, where the copper is coming from, it's creating pollution and inequity. We have a responsibility to recognize that we're trashing the planet. And although our little tiny piece of it might not be trashed, that we can't do it for other people. It's just, we have a moral responsibility here beyond greenhouse gas. So I always like to go back to the fact we can't have single issue policies. We can't just think about operational energy in buildings and ask, we really have to ask, what are we doing? What is the whole picture? How are we reducing the transportation to get to our buildings? How are we reducing the transportation in our construction? How are we reducing water in making buildings and in using buildings? And the same with energy. It's all interwoven. It's exciting that people are starting to see it that way. And it's exciting that so many good things are happening around the world. But we need to move quickly. It's very, very urgent. And so I'd like everybody to leave this presentation understanding that building reuse is climate action. As Anthony said, the very, very, very fastest way we can drive our greenhouse gas emissions out of the building sector is by reusing what we already have. Thank you very much.
Jean, that was awesome. Thank you so much. So we have had 4 amazing presentations by people who are thinking about these problems at a broad systems level. We've had presentations here that have asked us to rethink the values that drive how we plan cities and achieve densities, how much water we have in the high desert, rethink how renewables work and what they mean to equity. And lastly, to kind of rethink the role of preservation and the broader sustainability of our city. This is powerful stuff. these are all items that are connected. I'm super appreciative to Erick, to Jesse, to Mariel, to Jean for taking time to be with us tonight. These are people who are changing the world on the sustainability front. And I know the Q&A has been blowing up. I'd like to introduce Carlos Gamora. Carlos is going to moderate our Q&A so that I don't have to be looking at 5 screens, and I could maybe participate a little bit in this. Carlos, are you here?
I am, Anthony.
Thanks. So Carlos is an urban planner working to facilitate creative changes in the built environment. He currently works for the city of Santa Fe as a senior land use planner, where he advocates for long-range planning efforts. Many of the topics that we've talked about tonight. Carlos is also a board member at Friends of Architecture Santa Fe. Carlos, how would you like to start?
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I think it's been quite a pleasure. I want to thank all the presenters for giving us a peek behind some of these the curtains of some of how these systems work. As we're processing some of these questions from the audience, I think I'd like to start by first asking how each of the presenters is thinking about some of the personal changes versus some of these systematic changes. And we've touched on that. We've touched on water conservation, on transportation practices, on individual buildings, on whether we should have solar panels on our home versus community solar systems. And I'm wondering if each of the panelists can talk a little bit about how we could learn some from that, again, kind of the personal change in action versus some of the systematic change in action. Anthony, how about we start with you, since you were already talking about some of the systematic changes?
Sure. I'll tell you how I think about it. And the thing is, it's a both and for sure, right? There's no way I can feel good about using a single-use reusable water bottle, thinking about the energy that went into making that bottle, how long it's going to be around on the planet, the idea that we truck water around on diesel trucks, it's insanity, right? And so it's beyond morals. There's a kind of ethical dimension to it for sure, but collective or individual actions do add up, and that's absolutely important. I guess where I'm going in terms of starting this is my own personal journey. I think as an architect, prior to moving to Santa Fe, meeting in Missouri and being involved in Architecture 2030, I didn't understand the impacts of my design decisions fully. I wasn't measuring them. I didn't understand what a big deal the built environment was on the bottom line of greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. That framework, that opening pie chart, really does kind of, for me, satisfy a lot of questions that I have about, like, what am I doing and why is it important, and how can I better serve the communities that I'm a part of. And so that's my own personal connection to it. I think where it affects the conversation tonight, and really where I'm quite interested in going, with the panel and with the public, is, there's probably every one of the 70 or 80 people that are on this call tonight, feel good about doing those individual measures, right? They're all looking at them, or they've done them already, and all of that. But when it comes down to the big moves, when we look at something like the Midtown campus, right? We just had a developer pull out because the first-time costs of dealing with existing buildings were too much for the development deal, and they pulled out. And there was no recognition of the carbon costs associated with these huge concrete buildings that have roofs and walls and are actually, in some cases, currently housing people and have the potential to be renovated, because our system, our economy, our values, and our codes do not value the embodied carbon associated with those buildings. Or I'm thinking about all of the people who opposed ZIA development at City Council recently, a transit-oriented development that was going to be built next to a train station. We as a community invested in and put out there on open land. And the argument has been in favor of single family zoning, in favor of watering down this development, when by all rights, we should be looking at the greater good of building, high density, of creating walkable communities, of creating communities that plug into low carbon transit. And so that's the part I don't understand. We live, there's gonna be a lot of these kind of crazy universe moments tonight. But like, I don't understand why our friends and neighbors who believe so much in the water bottle and the bag and the solar panels and the electric car and stuff like that are not grasping the kind of long-term benefits. And it may be that we in government, we in the building profession, we in the industry really need to do a better job of messaging on these things. So that's end of rant for me, but that's the relationship between the two for me.
Aune, as we're talking about buildings, could you expand some on how you think about some of the systematic versus individual change and looking at buildings, and whether you're seeing things on a kind of local level, international level, how different policies are changing to think about buildings and preservation?
Well,
I'm gonna let Jean take that one for sure.
I think am I muted? I'm not muted.
You're good.
We can hear you.
The new language of our time. Am I muted? There are some places where policy is changing to recognize, for instance, Portland, Oregon, San Antonio, Texas, some in Seattle, to actually reduce both demolition and the size of new construction as a recognition of a sort of circular economy, that demolition has environmental impacts because of the waste and landfill it creates. But the real reason to reuse buildings is because of the avoided impacts of a replacement building. So whatever environmental impact building a building had, that's been spent. It doesn't really, it's not anything that we can recover. But what we can do is we can avoid the environmental impact of new construction or more construction. And I'm optimistic as more and more analysis happens and people get more aware of the holistic picture of greenhouse gas, that we'll start to see policies that shift our economic structure away from the more profitable, often more profitable demolition and replacement of buildings. And some groups actually many groups have sent suggestions to the new administration about how we can have policy shifts that do that. But I'm not an economist, but I know from my experience as an architect that it's always up against the economics. It's always about, sometimes we see so many buildings that are ignored for 100 years, and then people say, oh, but it's too expensive to renovate them. We can build a bigger building with more housing units, and sometimes that's the right thing to do, but we should be paying for the environmental cost of that, and we're not. But I think, we're talking about it, and we have better tools for analyzing it. So I am fairly optimistic about it. And I do see towns that are really reaching and changing this, not all in the United States. Much more is happening in Europe, where there is more carbon accounting being demanded of our design industry and our building industry.
And Jean, the illustration of this is in, there's parallels from the kind of energy code improvements, right? That without a doubt, building a less efficient building is less expensive. By using the code, we've really moved the industry along in terms of efficiency. And when it's the code minimum, when it's the barely legal requirement, it takes away that argument about expense. Usually we have arguments with clients about going beyond that code minimum. But we have an ordinance in Santa Fe that requires us to keep existing buildings and keep existing features. It is motivated by a history of tourism. It is motivated by some preservation concerns. It's motivated by the history of the H board in this town. But there's nothing that says that we couldn't have a similar type of requirement that would apply to an accounting for carbon. We're saying we value these buildings culturally and in terms of their history and in terms of their heritage, but we do the same with the code. There's no doubt that it would be easier to tear down most of the houses on the east side and build new, just talking about it in terms of dollars. But we as a society have put, or as a community have put a value on keeping those buildings. So there's a parallel there, I think.
Erick, I want to pass this a little bit to you and thinking about the systematic changes and individual changes. You were talking about regulations, you were talking about parking, you were talking about where Paris is going. I'd like to hear a little bit more. What do you see as some of the systematic things that we could change? How do we get to a more sustainable transportation future?
Yeah, Carlos, I appreciate the question. And I'd like to use the redesign of Cerrillos as an example. The NMDOT is going through a pretty epic process for redesigning from St. Mike's to St. Francis as the third redesign before they turn Cerrillos back over to the city of Santa Fe. The NMDOT has been negotiating with the city for 19 years to make this happen. So when you consider about what are the pressures that the NMDOT, the city, are under when considering redesigning Cerrillos, in my description of its entirety, is that there are codes, regulations that really do not allow for much flexibility. That if we do not examine and consider the origins of those regulations and why they're in place and say, maybe we can do something differently. Maybe we can reconstruct those regulations and codes to honor more the pedestrian, the bicyclist, the transit rider. Then maybe we can redesign roads that are more in balance with community versus focusing, and it's not a criticism, it's just a reality, that there will be a commitment to widen Cerrillos again for automobile capacity and movement. I have a mantra that we build what we measure. In transportation planning and transportation engineering, we measure the heck out of volumes of traffic, and then we try to accommodate, right? We do not measure bicycle movements. We do not measure pedestrian movements. And as a final comment is like, let's change that paradigm. Start to measure what we want. Thank you.
I think that's incredibly interesting. We build what we measure. And when we can't measure pedestrian movement or bike movement, we're not building for that. I think that's a really interesting point. Mariel, passing to you. You were talking about some of the individual solar systems versus community solar systems. How do we think about the return on investment differences there? How do we think about the different economies of scale? What are the kinds of systematic changes that you mentioned some regulations that you've been working on? What are some other kind of positive changes that you've seen across the country towards that?
In order to address the climate crisis, we are going to need public investment more than ever. It's just as simple as that. Yes, we can do all the personal changes, and we should, as much as we can. But let's just look at what happened in Texas. What happened in Texas was these gas suppliers who are under no regulation. These are not public power entities, right? Not municipalities, not tribes, but just for-profit companies. And literally, I heard, and maybe some of the participants also heard, the owners of these private corporations touting that it was a jackpot, that death, right, from this extreme storm, which is only going to happen more and more and more, was profitable for them. I'll just tell you a wonky fact. A week before the storm, it was $2.50 an MMBTU for gas. During that 10-day period, it was upwards of $250 an MMBTU. Not because there wasn't enough supply, but because there were greedy corporations who stole, who made money on the emergency and death of people. And we're going to have more of that in this climate crisis. Now, shift completely to a not-for-profit model, right? Which is, as I said before, I'm hoping that we have Santa Fe Public Power someday, and we're moving towards that, right? We brought this bill 2 years ago. We didn't even get a committee assignment. So far, we've passed one committee. We're hoping maybe tonight we'll hit our jackpot, which is, you know, what did we see in the COVID that was so beautiful to all of us? Mutual aid, right? In a non-for-profit situation, we care about resiliency. We care about life. We care about renewables and storage so we can address the climate challenge. We care about local jobs. We care about community. And that's really the heart of it. That, yeah, maybe we give up some profit for some of these companies and these corporations that are literally the 1%, but they're also the entities that are killing us. And we have to change the model so we can survive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Jesse, water utilities and electricity utility, very closely connected. We saw a systematic change in, I think you said 1995. How is that systematic change? How did that systematic change produce so many differences in how we're using water? And when you're talking about return flow pipelines and you're talking about reusing different types of water systems, how do we compare some of those systematic changes to personal changes?
Good questions. One of the interesting things about the fact that a public entity bought a private entity for a water utility in 1995 was it was sort of a flip-flop. I mean, I remember at that time there was privatization of water systems occurring, maybe not here, but in Peru is one that I remember. I'm not an expert on this, but I know that there was a big uproar about privatizing water, that it shouldn't be a source of profit. One of the interesting things I think in looking back at 1995 is when the city bought the water utility, one of the first things that was done was implementing a tiered rate structure so that you could have a certain amount of water at a fairly low price, but when you went into the higher sort of tier, you started to pay more. And I wonder if a private company could have done that. The messaging on that would have been much more difficult if a for-profit utility starts charging, because you want to say, well, we're charging to sort of send a price signal so that people use less water. But I think it was probably easier for a public organization to do that, to use that price signal. And then I guess on the question about sort of, I think there's a big, one of the pieces in water resources in Santa Fe is that we've kind of arrived at a sustainable place, but we think it's fleeting, and we need to try and figure out how to make our surface water, which we think of as sustainable, go farther. And so we're doing that at a huge scale with this return flow pipeline. But it can be done at an individual scale, and a bunch of questions that have come in have been about gray water. And so I want to say there's a couple pieces that can be done at an individual scale, and we currently incentivize those. So gray water, the idea of gray water is that all the water that you use indoors in your house, with the exception of the toilet water, which would be considered black water, is water that probably could be used outdoors. And so we incentivize using gray water from your washing machine to water plants. Ultimately, if we get to this big centralized solution that I'm talking about, where we have a return flow pipeline or we have direct potable reuse, then as a utility, we will no longer be incentivizing or paying people to do gray water, because we now sort of have an economy of scale of trying to use that water in a different way. But the idea of using rainwater will never go away. And ultimately, the most sustainable thing you can do at your house and in the long term would be figure out what landscaping you can support just with water off your roof. Now that might sound daunting, and with a 50-gallon rain barrel, that's probably not possible, but there are a lot of fascinating ideas out there. And Kim Shanahan, who's a local builder, and I think probably most of the folks on this call have heard of him, he's talking about these houses with bladders under the crawl space where water comes off the roof and fills the bladder up, and then that's used over a long period of time to support the irrigation outdoors. That sort of a thing is thinking way outside the box. There's regulatory problems, but those sorts of solutions end up taking you, I think, to a place where you could, at a local scale at your house, try and support your outdoor water use with what falls on your yard, on your property. And then at a large centralized scale, the water, all the potable water that comes into your house, or most of it, is going back down the drain so that we can reuse it in this larger sort of centralized solution.
Jesse, question about some of that. So we had a question from Sarah. Sarah was wondering, she was saying that she thought that rainwater capture at residences has to go through a permitting process, and was wondering if there's a way to simplify some of that process. And so when we're talking about regulations and what we could do, how we could encourage or how we're discouraging current actions, is that a problem right now? How can we make some of these individual conservation efforts easier?
You know, if you all wouldn't mind, I would like to share a website by way of answering this question. So I was appreciating getting it because I don't go to this website as much as I should, because my conservation program, the conservation program at the city is run by the able personage of Christine Chavez, and she takes care of it. So I don't need to know the details. But in answering that question, I looked up this website, which is Save Water Santa Fe. And under Save Water Santa Fe, there's rebates, and under rebates, there's outdoor rebates. And I want to point to the fact that right now you can get paid. Now, you wouldn't get a check in the mail. You would get a credit to your water bill, but you can get paid for more efficient irrigation equipment. You can get paid for setting up a gray water system for laundry to landscape, and you can get paid for buying rain barrels or installing a larger catchment system at your house. So these things, especially at a small scale, at the rain barrel scale, you don't need a permit, and we encourage you to do it. Go and we'll help you pay for it.
Thank you. And Jesse, another question from Sarah was about whether the city's considering moving to a reclaimed water system and using that more directly. Are there plans for that we're moving forward with?
And we call that non-potable reuse, or purple pipe, sometimes it's referred to, and some cities have sort of a whole network, and you can get it to your house. We have a purple pipe system that serves turf irrigation or grass irrigation at Swan Park, at the Downs, at the Country Club, at Marty Sanchez Golf Club, at the MRC, the Municipal Recreation Complex. All of that grass is grown with effluent, and so that's non-potable reuse. We did a big study in 2017 looking at what's the best bang for the buck in terms of how we can use this effluent. And we looked at expanding that, but there's a lot of elevation in the town, and all the effluent's at the lowest spot. That's why the treatment plant's there, because all of the sewer flows downhill to there. So then we'd have to pump it back up to these other spots. The demand, it doesn't pencil out. The economics of it are not there. And so it seems to me for our community, we do have it, and growth and turf and stuff that happens on that side of town, on the lower end of town, it may be an option. But I think for us, it'll more be about trying to grow what you have in your yard with what falls from the sky, and then some larger sort of reuse system.
Thinking about reuse, I'm wondering, I'm not sure if this is a question for Anthony or Jean, but in talking about reuse of different kinds of buildings on Midtown, for instance, and some of the difficulty with that, when can we reuse those? How are ways that we could change how we think about that return on carbon investment?
I suspect Anthony has a better handle on what kind of buildings are in Midtown and what the issues are. So I think I'll defer to him on this.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on at Midtown. We have some existing big structures, right? And some of them have been used as student housing, and like, I appreciate that first-time construction costs are often higher for some existing building remodel projects where you're doing extensive renovations to shoehorn your program into an existing shell. But that campus also has buildings that are done by Philippe Register and that are protected by our historic districts. And so there are other values within those buildings, even beyond their embodied carbon. As far as techniques for modifying existing buildings, Gene, I think that's where I would defer to you, is like, what kinds of options do we have? I think, my mind immediately goes to, like, well, let's look at what's appropriate for this existing building. It starts to chip away at my embodied carbon total for project. I may be able to build a new space next to it, right? Or I may be able to kind of really think about this through a conservation lens. What do I not have to build? How do I look at a client's program and actually reduce it as the first measure of design? You do a lot more of this than I do on an everyday basis.
Yeah, I think actually I was just having this conversation within the architecture and design community. We don't actually, most architecture design schools don't ever talk about building reuse. It's unusual to find schools that actually have a design studio that is about building reuse, and yet existing buildings outnumber new construction 9 to 1. And there are estimates that I've actually never been able to footnote that the billable hours for most architects is 70% existing buildings and potentially 30% new. That came from Carl Elefante, but he could never tell me where he got the data. So, but we have to love him for the way he can bandy the facts around. He's former president of the AIA. And I'm being recorded. Hi, Carl. But the point is, there are a lot of existing buildings, and they are not all going to be torn down. We can't afford to tear them down. We need to reuse them, and it's really an exciting design opportunity to think creatively about how you can reuse them. And that's actually also part of the challenge to the heritage community is we have a reputation of being the agency of no, you can't replace those windows. No, you can't put sun shading on it. No, you can't use photovoltaics. No, you can't put a visible green roof on it. I think we have to really, really, really reconsider what stewardship means and how buildings can change and how that's a positive thing. I think within the preservation community, we should be looking at materials that may not be the same as the original materials. We should be looking at materials that actually have a longer service life, that are going to take care of the buildings longer. And so they're just, there are endless ways to reuse buildings. No, they aren't the same as new buildings, but what's the fun of that? Reuse is so much more challenging and so much more creative. Let's make a world that is constantly reinventing itself, not by. I think actually, Erick, I forget the planner who always said you had to tear down a city in order to make a good city. Let's make cities that actually reinvent themselves without tearing themselves down and replacing. That's what really good design is all about. So I've rarely met a building that I didn't feel could be repurposed. I'm not very fond of the Victorian era, but you can still do good things with them.
If I could
go ahead, please, Mariel.
It's interesting. I'm just checking out the Q&A, and people are really asking questions about water reuse and buildings in the Midtown campus. And imagine if that was the visionary little part of Santa Fe that had reuse, that we had fruit trees that, and, only washer machines that, first of all, not one per family, but, all the things that, and, I'd be happy to spend my time on energy, and Jesse could work on the water part, and, Eric could help on the transportation part in that little walkable Midtown city. And I think that there's so many people, talented people, not only on this Zoom call, but in this city, who would love to say, wow, mixed use, mixed race, mixed age, wouldn't it be great if we had cafes and some fabulous, everybody loves ethnic food, and, but fruit trees, and, from washer machines that, had their water there. I mean, I think we should all, knock on Mayor Alan Weber's door and say, let's create that beautiful vision, and let's get lots of people in the room, and make sure that, of course, our immigrant community and people of color community is included, so that the cultural heritage, like you've beautifully woven into this whole story, Jean, is part of that. And I just think, they would really be the city different. So anyway, that's an exciting imagination project.
Mariel, though, I'm really happy you brought out, Miles and some other people have been asking about Midtown. What, from an energy, electricity perspective, what do you think would be the most exciting thing we could do at Midtown?
I mean, if community solar would pass this legislative session, we could have a community solar project on all those buildings and all that parking space that people could park their cars under, just like the Genevieve Chavez Center. And we should have fossil fuel free energy for that 100%. I think that we should not be able to build any buildings in Santa Fe at all that didn't have solar on it. I mean, we live in the land of the sunzia on our flag. So,
Jesse, there was a specific question from Miles about how we could use water in Midtown, and going further, what do you see as an exciting element, an exciting possibility for a place like Midtown from a water perspective?
I'm not expert enough to say, but I think all about how we irrigate outside, in terms of whether that's coming from gray water or whether that's coming from rainwater. I think that sort of demonstration would be fantastic. Real large scale rainwater catchment, or maybe small scale, terracing. And I am not the expert, but that would be really cool to demonstrate sort of the cutting edge of those technologies.
And Eric, for you, how could we rethink a space like Midtown from a more transformative, creative transportation perspective? What does that look like?
Yeah, great question. It's a question that I wish I would have just given you, because it's such a profound opportunity. And here it is that, and I've thought about this a lot, is that what can be done there would challenge on its face, in a good way and respectful way, all of the codes and regulations that we have in place today that empower suburban development. And I'll give an example. The MPO has a travel demand model that predicts, makes assumptions, and has criteria about when development occurs, how the network should be built out. I argue that the assumptions that are put into that are biased for suburban development. And there's a good reason for that, because suburban development has contributed to the language of transportation planning, going back to the measure. So circling back, I think as it relates to what Mariel was speaking to, of redefining how we build streets, roads, and for who, will fundamentally challenge the codes and regulations that continue sprawl today and ask the question, can we change those for a greater community?
And Eric, related to some of that, Simon was asking the question about, are there some examples, hopefully in Santa Fe, maybe in some other areas where we have reimagined roads or intersections that might have the same traffic flow, car, pedestrian, public transit usage? Are there some good examples that we could learn from?
Yeah, I love it. Let's start with Seiler Road. Seiler was a 4-lane facility. About 10 years ago, the city with its leadership said, hey, do we need these 4 lanes? It's called a road diet. It's rescaling a road to be more appropriate for traffic, for movements of people, not just cars. Right now, the city and the DOT are working in harmony to redesign Guadalupe Street, the north end, from a 4-lane facility to a 2-lane facility that honors what is the movement of people, not just the movement of cars. Again, there's a consideration for, and I love that image I hope that you all saw from 1978 of St. Mike's. Is that what we want for this community? So many people, I haven't heard anybody else say, oh, let's keep this facility. Let's right size it for people. So there are great examples of the energy and opportunity to fundamentally change how we are continuing in a trajectory. It is not easy though.
Now, Eric, this also gets at some of the cultural aspect is what are the cultural shifts that have to happen in the transportation world to help get to a more sustainable transportation future? Yeah,
and I think I spoke a little bit about that in my presentation on the paradox of congestion and how sort of what we are conditioned in this country to accept as the status quo. That, oh, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to have the luxury of free parking anywhere and everywhere. And there was a good question in the chat box about what the city could do to tame Cerrillos. And my argument is that if you first start to look at the land uses, the zoning that enables so much parking free, so much less designed for pedestrians in this, what I call the watershed of Cerrillos, you start to reverse that. And this is not just an opinion. This is demonstrable through other communities who've taken that challenge. They've downsized the parking, and it changes the way people move through a system. And then it ultimately changes the roadway. I believe that to be true.
Carlos, if I may, one of the things that's occurring to me as we have this interdisciplinary panel and are thinking about sustainability from different angles here tonight is the amount of overlap and the amount of learning that goes on between these presentations, right? And things that maybe I wasn't even seeing when we kind of set up this group. One of the things that really struck me in Jesse's presentation and the subsequent conversation with Jean about solar panels in the historic district is our values, right? Like, so, the city of Santa Fe has achieved so much through water conservation. The connection to that, from that to the type of architecture that we're focused on preserving here, which was so much about scarcity, which was so much about relative poverty in terms of its construction, which was in its truest form all the way through into the 1950s, a virtually carbon neutral, maybe even carbon positive architecture that was built out of our and carbon sequestering trees and didn't use anything that was ever made in a factory that consumed energy. These and I would include in that the idea of renewable energy and the way that those buildings also use the sun. To me, it's crazy that we are valuing just the appearance of things, right? This discussion of, like, can we change materials? Can we change details? Can we change the look of historic buildings to make them perform better? It seems so obvious to me that, you know, that if we connect, we go past just mere appearances, we could connect with that deeper ethos of how these buildings came to be in the world, and connect that to like where we're going, which I think is crucial. And I'm also thinking about like kind of the bigger macro things, like, you know, Eric, you're talking about road diet, remaking roads and all of that. And I'm instantly seeing parallels between building reuse and infrastructure reuse, right? You know, the measuring that you're talking about with regard to, you know, pedestrians and all of that stuff should also be the measuring that, you know, that Gene is doing, and the measuring of transportation emissions. I know the city keeps data on all this stuff about how many miles, you know, most workers in the city drive. But if we really think about that problem, right, that this is so wasteful to kind of extend infrastructure all the way out there. Carlos, you know, I've talked to you before. I know about, you know, city streets that are dedicated back to the city from developers of new subdivisions are a loss. We can't afford, we don't have the tax revenue to support their maintenance over time. We live in this crazy upside down world. And like, what if we said, okay, that all of that infrastructure exists, you know, how do we densify it? How do we reuse it the way that we're talking about reusing buildings? You know, all of this stuff is really, really connected on profound levels. And what I really, really appreciate about everybody's presentations tonight is that each one has given us a kind of way of scrutinizing or thinking differently about other fields. And I'm really so excited that the public has also been in with us on this conversation, willing to play in this sandbox. So I don't know, there's just a thought. I'm sorry to be long-winded, but those are some things that I'm seeing in the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're starting to run out of time. Gene, go for it.
No, I was just going to say that I look forward to seeing Santa Fe provide an example with your mid-city neighborhood to your mid, or did I call it midtown neighborhood, that really envisions a different way of addressing all of these things. Sounds like an incredible opportunity.
And something else that I've seen in a lot of these different conversations is also thinking about, Anthony, you were talking about values, but again, kind of balancing heritage with change. That's something that Santa Fe really has to be thinking about. And each of you were touching on different ways that we think about heritage, that we think about community, that we think about values. And in some ways, we're trying to preserve those. We're trying to preserve exactly what makes Santa Fe special. And in another way, we also have to figure out how we are changing and managing growth in the built environment, which is a tremendous difficulty. Jesse was talking about ways that we could expand how we grow. Mariel, you were talking about ways that we could create more sustainable, not just from an electricity, but also income and how we have revenue, where revenue is going, thinking about economic development, all of that. Erick talking about transportation practices and how we move and how the built environment works for us in different ways. And Gene and Anthony both talking about those buildings, how we're thinking about buildings and how those buildings are able to work with us, partially from a preservation perspective, from the historical preservation perspective, but also about how we can renovate those in ways that are still more sustainable than demolishing and building new sometimes. And you know, it's not a everything. It's not saying that there's one way, but it is looking at those different things that we're measuring. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, what do we all want really mostly in life? Like really, really? We want to belong, right? And if we could have communities that that were more equitable, that would make us feel a whole lot better. And if we had sustainable communities where we were actually having this respect for culture, which I think that we all want, and we just have been so, I don't know what else to say, but our minds have been so it's almost like by osmosis from capitalism, we think so individually, and it's just harmed us. It's harmed us. I will say that this idea of a local public power, just to give you one idea, I think Picker East makes about $20,000 a month. And I said to Mayor Weber, I said, we need 100 megawatts. They're using 1 megawatt, but for Santa Fe City and County, we need 100 megawatts. Imagine what we would do with $2 million a month if we could reinvest that back into Santa Fe. He wants to address homelessness or healthcare or education or all these things that are crises. Well, instead of exporting that money, to relocalize it and build these kinds of real communities that we truly want. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left. I think I'm going to close it out. We have a couple of announcements to make, but before we get there, I wanted to thank Jean, Jesse, Mariel, and Eric for joining us tonight and taking the time to do such incredible presentations and to explain your work to us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Carlos, thank you for being a brilliant moderator tonight for tonight's discussion and for the great questions. Thanks everybody who's attended and who's asked questions. I really, really appreciate the conversation. Even if we didn't get to your question, it's gone into the mix and the blender, and it's been fed up to Carlos, and it's informed what he's been talking about. I also want to thank our revisioning history team. That's Gayla Bechtel, Lisa Roach, Carlos Gamora, and Chris Longley-Pistema, who is running the board behind the scene, and to the rest of the Friends board. I'm going to show a quick couple slides about upcoming events. One of them is related to what we're talking about, and this is going to be a little tricky. Share screen. Sorry. PowerPoint. No.
In the meantime, Anthony, I did just want to point out that the recording of this will be on the website. If anyone wants to go take a look at that.
Great. I think I'm ready. Okay, everybody can see my screen. Oops. So please join us in May 27th, when we come back with the Revisioning History series and we talk about revisioning housing. Carlos is organizing that panel, and it promises to be an incredibly lively discussion about something that's a really hot button topic in Santa Fe. Of course, all of these topics in this series are interrelated, so it's a matter of continuing the conversation. I also want to highlight our newest program, Spaces Speak. This is the virtual tours program developed by Friends. This is a crowdsourced history of our city and the spaces within it. Folks are asked to contribute images, stories, slides, little videos about spaces that they find unique and compelling in Santa Fe. All of these are geo-mapped onto a Google map of Santa Fe, and you can click on them and enjoy stories about different spaces in Santa Fe. It's a dynamite program. Love for you to see it, and more importantly, would love everyone to contribute to this growing archive of stories in Santa Fe. Also coming up are the rest of the Pechacucha events that we're doing this year. Wednesday, April 28th is Volume 10 Flow. Boundaries on July 21st, and Artifacts on October 27th. We're looking for contributors to all of these sessions that are coming up. We have such a kind of a brilliant Pechacucha culture in Santa Fe. Please join us. And then lastly, if you like what we're doing, we're an all-volunteer working board. We are incredibly grateful for the contributions that you have provided. We're grateful for you joining us. If you'd like to volunteer, if you'd like to contribute, please go to architecturesantafe.org. And especially we'd like to thank Craig Hoops of Hoops and Associates and Subi Bowden Associates for underwriting these events. I think that's all I have. I want to thank everybody for coming and have a great night.